We now look at consistent application, which is a normative method of engaging in argumentation. So, definition is this. Consistent application involves applying a principle, standard, rule, etc. in the same way to similar beings in similar circumstances. One is being consistent about how it's applied, when it is applied to entities that are similar and the context is similar. And a consistent application, obviously enough, involves not doing that, not applying the same standard in the same way to entities that are similar in similar context. Now, the foundation for this is generally three common moral assumptions. And these are assumptions in the sense that not everyone agrees with them. They would require proof if you were to want to establish them. But here are the grounding assumptions for consistent application. The first is the notion of equality, that people, at least moral equality, that people are initially at least morally equal and must be treated as such. Secondly, impartiality. This is the assumption that morality must be impartial, and this would require consistent application of standards and principles. Otherwise, obviously, if one was inconsistent, one would be partial, one would be biased. And so inconsistent application would be by definition non-impartial. There's also a critical assumption of relevant difference. And this is some normative assumption applying to those who accept it in ethics, law, policy, etc. And it's the notion that different treatment must be justified by, obviously enough, relevant differences. Otherwise, one is being not consistent, one is being inconsistent. And all three of these can, of course, be challenged. And if one is able to show that, there's not equality, that impartiality should not be accepted, or relevant difference should not be accepted, that would undercut consistent application. So how is this particular method used? Like logical consistency, this is typically an attack method in the sense that if you're using this, you would generally not be actively defending your own position by presenting consistent application. You would be criticizing a position held by someone else. So here's how it would work. So methodology is this. The first step is to show that a principle, standard, rule, etc. has been applied differently in situations that are not adequately different. Second step, conclude from this that the principle has been applied inconsistently. And a third optional step is to argue that the principle should be applied consistently. So as an argument, template, you would use the following structure. So the first premise would be to show that a particular principle, standard or rule, etc., whatever you're dealing with, has been applied differently in situations that are not adequately or relevantly different. And then you draw the kind of obvious conclusion that that principle or standard has been applied inconsistently. For example, imagine that two people are watching, television, or and a advertisement comes up for a woman's only gym. Now, imagine that one of the people on the couch, we'll call her Barbara, that she claims that male-only country clubs are immoral and should be open to women. She's claimed this earlier. But then the advertisement appears for women's only gym, and the other person watching the show with her turns to her, we'll call this person, say, Tom, and Tom says, "Hey, how do you feel about women's only gyms, given your view on male-only country clubs?" And if Barbara says that women should be allowed to have women-only gyms, but men should not be allowed to have men-only country clubs, then this would seem to be an inconsistent application. Because if Barber's principle is that exclusion based on gender is immoral, then the principle is not being applied consistently. So, is there, though, a way around this accusation of apparent inconsistency? And the answer is, of course there is. There's pretty much always a way to reply to an argument. So if someone seems to be holding principles that are inconsistent, they hold to a principle, say, of equality, but then they seem to have what people often call like a double standard. They have one for, say, that applies to men, one that applies to women. Then how can a person, in a rational way, in a good faith way, address such a criticism? And here's the response. Now, one response is not really a defense. This rarely happens, a person could say, gosh, I'm being inconsistent. I need to, change my principles or their application. So if someone was presenting, a view they believe in, say, gender equality, and they present, different standards, for men and for women, they might say, gosh, I'm being, sexist or something, and change their views. And this sometimes happens, but people generally prefer not to admit being mistaken. So what's more likely to occur is something that would actually defend against this charge. And this can be done in good faith and rationally, because there are cases where what seems to be inconsistent is not inconsistent, that the distinction is relevant. For example, to illustrate the way this is done, is you try to show that the inconsistency that you're accused of, or if someone else is accused of it, they would attempt to show that their alleged inconsistency is not really real inconsistency. And the way to do this, typically, is to show that there is that relevant difference that makes the situations different enough so that the application of the principle in a different way is justified. Going back to the example of country clubs and gyms. So taking our hypothetical person who is opposed to male-only country clubs and also actually supporting women's-only gyms, how could they defend that? Again, this seems to be on the face of it. Someone might say, this person is doing a double standard. One standard for men who can't have their own country clubs and hang out with the boys and smoke cigars and so forth away from women. But women are allowed to have their own gym away from men. This is inconsistent. So one way to defend this is to say that country clubs and gyms are relevantly different. That the setting, in the case of excluding women from country clubs would be wrong because of a relevant difference between gyms and country clubs. One could also point out relevant differences between men and women. And this, of course, runs the risk of running into accusations of sexism. But one way this is commonly defended is to argue that when women attend a country club that was male exclusive, they're unlikely to make the men there feel like harassed or uncomfortable, etc. But defenders of women-only gyms often make the case that if women would prefer not to have men, staring at them, harassing them, and so forth, that men behave in a way relevant differently from women in general, and so women should have a space away from men. And the argument essentially is there's a relevant difference in behavior, but between, say, the locations, country clubs and gyms, in terms of how activities one is doing. And one could also make the case, which could be argued to be sexist, is that men behave differently from women in relevant ways that would justify having women's only gyms and not men's only country clubs. And whatever argument one gives, this argument could also be argued against, because one can always keep arguing. So first option is become consistent. Say, gosh, I am mistaken. I will mend my ways. I will become consistent. One can also make a good faith defense that the apparent inconsistency is not really an inconsistency. A third option is to reject the principle that's being attributed to a person. Now, out in the wild, the real world, people generally don't lay out their moral principles. They don't say, my moral principles are this, that, and this, therefore I hold to these particular views. Often people will just say things, and you kind of have to guess at their principle. So, for example, if someone says that they support, women's only gyms, but oppose men's only country clubs, you might assume that they're operating on a principle of like gender equality, but they're being inconsistent, but their principle might not be that at all. So imagine, let's go back to the hypothetical situation. The person says, they see a news story that a men's only country club is being legally required to admit women. And they're like, yes, that's good. I support this. And then an advertisement for a women's only gym comes up, and person on the couch beside them says, hey, what about this? This seems to be, are you supportive of this? And the person says, yes, I support women's only gyms. And the person says back to them, aha, you're being inconsistent. You're rejecting gender equality. Now, the person does have the option to say, oh, I don't support gender equality at all. I support the view that the principle might be that they believe that women should be treated equally, except when it is in their advantage to being treated differently. This is something people sometimes present as somewhat conspiracy theories about views of equality, but it could be a person's principle, that some people should be treated equally, except when there's an advantage to be treated, say, in a different manner. And that would be a principle, and it would be consistent with that view. So if the person holds that women should be treated equally, except when it's an advantage to be treated differently, that would be perfectly consistent to having, country clubs that were formerly male only, open to women, and also having women exclusive gyms. There'd be no inconsistency there in terms of applying that principle. A person could also have a principle that people should not be discriminated against, except in cases when the presence of one gender would create undue discomfort to the other gender. In that case, as I noted earlier, women being present at a formerly men's country club, probably wouldn't cause men to feel, threatened and endangered and in discomfort. But in the case of a gym, because it's, people are working out, often wearing, gym clothing, etc., that women might feel threatened and, judged, etc., in that context. And so that principle would be applying consistently. Now, principles, of course, can be the person's actual principle when they reject the principle that's attributed to them. That, of course, doesn't automatically defend them. The new principle, or their principle they claim, is also subject to evaluation. So going back to the hypothetical case, if someone says, oh, I believe in equality for women, except when it's their advantage to be treated differently, advantageously, you could argue, well, that's not a very good moral principle because it goes against the notion of equality, impartiality, and relevant difference. It's just sexism, essentially, in this case, one could argue. Now, of course, this could be argued further because one, again, can always argue. The idea that people should not be discriminated except in case of the presence of one gender would create undue discomfort of the other could be subject to, again, criticism and could be subject to further defense. And so a reasonable, potentially principled defense is to say, hey, you're mistaking my principle. Sure, that principle would be inconsistent in this case, but my principle is a different one. And then the fight would move, or the discussion would move to, is this alleged attributed principle their real principle? Are they making the case in good faith? And is it actually a defensible principle standard, etc.? A final option, which is kind of extreme, but an option, is to argue against the grounding assumptions of this method: equality, impartiality, and relevant difference, and basically destroy or attempt to destroy the notion that principles should be applied consistently. And that would be an option. One cannot simply just say, oh, I just believe in inconsistent application, so I can do whatever I want. I mean, one could say that, but that wouldn't be a good logical defense. One would have to try to argue that, one should not accept equality or impartiality or relevant difference. And if that case could be made, then that would be a way of defending against this method, essentially by undercutting the method itself. So that's a look at consistent application. The gist of it, again, is a critical method, essentially an attack method, showing that someone is applying a principle attributed to them in a way that seems inconsistent. The defense against it is either become consistent, or show that inconsistency is apparent and not real, or defend it by saying this principle that's attributed is incorrect, here's the actual principle, then defending that, or in the more extreme side, completely undercutting the method. So that concludes a look at consistent application, and I'll see you in the future.